Detective Elric Graves was no stranger to bizarre cases, but the file he reviewed during his flight to Brazil unsettled even him. 5 men, each found dead within a month, had died under circumstances no forensic expert could explain. All were local laborers from the remote village of Lago do Cicero, located deep in the verdant heart of São Paulo's countryside. The autopsy reports were eerily similar, lungs filled with water, faces twisted in expressions of pure terror. Yet there were no signs of physical struggle, no drowning locations near the bodies, and no evidence of foul play. The strangest detail. Witnesses swore they heard a woman crying by the river the nights the men died. The legend of La Llorona, the weeping woman, was well known across Latin America. In folklore, she was a grieving mother doomed to wander waterways, seeking her lost children and luring victims to their deaths. But why had the ghost traveled here, to a Brazilian village far from her roots? As the plane touched down, Graves folded the file shut. Whether ghost or clever killer, this case had all the hallmarks of a truth buried in legend. Lago do Cicero was a quaint, isolated village. Its vibrancy was muted, the streets quiet and its people glancing at strangers with suspicion. Graves immediately noticed the tension in the air, whispers and hurried movements that told him they feared something beyond the ordinary. He was met by Constable Paulo, a young man who wore his nervousness plainly on his face. Paulo drove Graves to the river where the bodies had been discovered. The 2-mile journey was bumpy, the path lined with towering tropical trees whose branches entwined overhead, casting eerie shadows. At the riverbank, the serenity of the scene belied the horror it had witnessed. Crystal clear water reflected the deep green canopy above. Graves crouched at the edge, running a gloved hand over the soil. The bodies were all found close to the river, Paulo said, his voice low. But, there were no footprints leading here. No signs they were dragged. Graves frowned. And yet, their lungs were filled with water. Paulo nodded, his voice trembling. The villagers say it's La Llorona. Graves decided to stay in a small inn near the river, despite the villagers' warnings. The innkeeper, Dona Marta, a stout, serious woman, refused to look him in the eye when she brought him his dinner. You shouldn't stay here, she muttered, wringing her apron. The river cries at night. No good comes to those who listen. Graves dismissed her warning, but he stayed alert as the hours ticked by. Just before midnight, he heard it, the sound of soft, mournful crying. He stepped outside, the humid air clinging to his skin. The crying grew louder, unmistakable now. It wasn't coming from the village but the direction of the river. Graves followed the sound cautiously, the beam of his flashlight slicing through the darkness. When he reached the water's edge, he froze. A figure stood knee-deep in the river, shrouded in mist. Her hair hung like a dark curtain over her face, her shoulders trembling with sobs. La Llorona, he murmured, gripping the iron dagger in his coat. Graves called out to the figure. Who are you? What do you want? The woman's sobs grew louder, her shoulders shaking violently. Slowly, she raised her head. Graves couldn't see her face, only the hollow glow of her eyes shining through the darkness. Before he could step closer, she let out a blood-curdling scream that rattled the trees and sent icy needles racing down his spine. The flashlight flickered, and when it steadied, the figure was gone. Graves stood there, his heart pounding. He had seen many strange things in his career, but this felt personal. The next morning, Graves began interviewing the families of the 5 men who had died. Each story painted a hauntingly similar picture. The victims had all heard the crying by the river. Some had gone to investigate, while others had reported strange dreams of a woman in white calling their names. One widow, Maria, described her husband's final days. He told me he saw her, she whispered, clutching a rosary. She was crying, but when he got closer, she turned. He said her face was empty, and her voice. Maria broke off, shaking her head. Her voice was what? Graves prompted. Like drowning, she said finally. It made him feel like he couldn't breathe. Returning to the river with Paulo, Graves searched for anything unusual. As they waded into the shallows, Graves noticed the water grew colder the deeper they went, unnaturally so. At the river's center, they found something strange, a cluster of stones arranged in a near-perfect circle. Carved into each stone were intricate symbols, some resembling tears, others waves. They pulsed faintly with an unnatural light. These stones weren't placed here naturally, Graves said. They're part of something, a ritual, maybe. Something ancient. Paulo paled. Magic? Graves didn't answer. He pocketed one of the stones, determined to uncover its meaning. Back in the village, Graves sought out an elder named Consuela, known for her knowledge of folklore. She told him the legend of La Llorona, a mother who drowned herself after losing her children and was cursed to haunt waterways, seeking vengeance and solace. But why would she come here, to Brazil? Graves asked. Consuela's expression darkened. This river has seen its share of sorrow. Perhaps the tragedies here called to her. That night, Graves returned to the river with the stone. As he examined it under his flashlight, he noticed something troubling, a hairline crack running through its surface. The seal was broken, he muttered. Paulo, standing nearby, looked confused. Seal. What do you mean? Graves gestured to the river. The stones were arranged to trap her. But if the seal was disturbed, she could escape, and lash out. Who would break it? Paulo asked. Someone who didn't know what they were doing, Graves said grimly. Or someone who wanted her free. That night, the crying came again, louder and more insistent. Graves heard it even in his dreams, a mournful wail that pulled him toward the river. When he woke, he was standing at the edge of the water, the stone glowing faintly in his hand. La Llorona was there, her hollow eyes fixed on him. This time, she spoke, her voice like a ripple through deep water. Fix what they broke, she whispered. Graves sat by the river the next morning, holding the cracked stone in his hand. Its carvings, spirals of tears and waves, glowed faintly in the sunlight. Nearby, Paulo paced nervously, occasionally glancing at the water as if expecting La Llorona to rise from its depths. She said to fix what they broke, Graves muttered. That means the seal. But it's not just the stones, there's something else tying her here. Paulo crouched beside him. The men who disturbed the river, do you think they caused this? Unwittingly, maybe, Graves replied. But they wouldn't have known about the seal. Someone else might have, though, someone who wanted her free. Paulo looked alarmed. Why would anyone want that? Graves didn't answer. He rose to his feet, slipping the stone into his pocket. We need answers, and I have a feeling Consuela knows more than she's letting on. Consuela's home was modest, filled with old wooden furniture and shelves lined with jars of herbs and trinkets. She greeted Graves and Paulo cautiously, her sharp eyes scanning their faces. You've seen her again, haven't you? She asked. Graves nodded. She told me to fix what was broken. What aren't you telling me, Consuela? The elder hesitated, her fingers twitching as though debating whether to speak. Finally, she sighed. Years ago, before the village grew, this river was sacred. The seal was placed to protect it, and to trap the spirits tied to its sorrow. La Llorona isn't the only one. Graves frowned. There are others. Not anymore, Consuela said. She is all that remains. The seal kept her bound, but when those fools disturbed it, she trailed off, her expression darkening. Who set the seal? Graves asked. Consuela gestured to a faded book on her table. It was my grandmother's doing. She was a curandera, a healer and a seer. She knew how to trap spirits, but also how to release them. Graves picked up the book, flipping through its brittle pages. Inside were sketches of the stones, diagrams of the seal, and notes written in Portuguese. She didn't just trap La Llorona, Graves said. She tethered her here to keep the river's sorrow contained. Back at the inn, Graves studied the book late into the night. The text described a ritual for repairing the seal, but it was complicated, requiring not just the stones but an offering tied to the spirit's grief. An offering of remembrance, Graves read aloud. Something meaningful to her sorrow. Paulo, sitting nearby, frowned. How do we know what she wants? Graves leaned back, his sharp mind piecing together the fragments. La Llorona's grief is rooted in the loss of her children. If we can offer something symbolic of that, it might soothe her enough to restore the seal. The next morning, Graves returned to Consuela with the book in hand. We need something tied to her story, he said. Something that represents the children she lost. Consuela thought for a moment, then retrieved a small wooden box from a shelf. Inside was an old, handmade doll. Its dress was tattered, its face faded, but it had a fragile, innocent charm. This belonged to a woman who drowned herself here many years ago, Consuela explained. She lost her child to illness and believed the river could reunite them. Graves held the doll carefully. This might work. That night, Graves and Paulo returned to the river with the doll and the cracked stone. The wailing began as they approached, louder and more anguished than ever. Graves stepped forward, holding the doll aloft. La Llorona. We know your pain. We've come to restore the balance. The water rippled violently, and the spectral figure rose from its depths, her hollow eyes glowing like distant stars. She stared at the doll, her sobs softening into a low, mournful hum. Graves moved closer, his voice calm but firm. Let us help you. Let us fix what was broken. Graves waded into the river, the cold water biting at his legs. Paulo followed reluctantly, clutching the remaining stones. Together, they swam to the center where the circle lay partially intact. Graves placed the doll at the heart of the circle, its fragile form seeming to absorb the faint light from the carvings. One by one, he and Paulo positioned the stones, realigning them to complete the seal. The moment the final stone clicked into place, the circle glowed brightly, its carvings radiating an intense blue light. The water grew calm, its surface smooth as glass. La Llorona appeared at the edge of the circle, her form flickering. She reached toward the doll, her translucent fingers trembling. As she touched it, her sobs turned to quiet whispers. Graves watched as the spectral figure seemed to fade, her hollow eyes softening. She's letting go, he murmured. The light from the seal enveloped her, and with a final, mournful wail, she dissolved into the water. The wailing ceased, replaced by an almost deafening silence. The river seemed brighter, its waters clearer than before. The air grew warm, and the oppressive chill that had plagued the village lifted. It's done, Paulo said, his voice shaky. Graves nodded. For now. The villagers, grateful for the peace restored to their home, built a small shrine near the river to honor La Llorona and the lives lost to her grief. Graves watched as they lit candles and placed flowers, ensuring her story would not be forgotten. She wasn't just a ghost, Graves said to Paulo. She was a story, a memory of sorrow that needed to be acknowledged. On his last night in Lago do Cicero, Graves stood by the river, staring at the calm waters. For a moment, he thought he saw her, a faint outline of a woman with long hair, her head bowed. When he blinked, she was gone. As Graves rode away from the village, he carried the book and the memory of La Llorona with him. He knew this wouldn't be the last time he encountered a legend that blurred the line between myth and reality. The river, now at peace, shimmered in the distance, a testament to the delicate balance between the living and the lost. As Detective Elric Graves traveled away from Lago do Cicero, the events of the past days replayed in his mind. The case had been unlike any other, rooted in sorrow and legend, but with a profound sense of humanity at its core. Late one evening, as he camped along a quiet trail leading back toward the larger cities, Graves opened Consuela's old book. The faint glow of his lantern illuminated the brittle pages, their edges frayed from years of use. He turned to a section he hadn't yet read, a passage describing the aftermath of seals like the one they had repaired. It spoke of spirits lingering near the edge of release, tethered not by vengeance but by memory. "The sorrow remains as long as there are those who remember," Graves read aloud. He closed the book, his thoughts lingering on La Llorona. Her wailing had ceased, but would her memory ever truly fade? Days later, Graves arrived in São Paulo, the bustling city a stark contrast to the tranquility of Lago do Cicero. The case of La Llorona had drawn the attention of more than just the villagers. Word of his work had reached others who dealt in the strange and unexplained. At a small café tucked in a narrow street, a man approached him, a professor from a nearby university who specialized in folklore and anthropology. "You must be Detective Graves," the man said, extending a hand. "I've heard about your unusual investigations." Graves raised an eyebrow but shook the man's hand. "What can I do for you?" The professor leaned in, lowering his voice. "There's a story you need to hear. It comes from the Amazon, a legend about a creature that walks like a man but hunts like a beast. Locals call it the Curupra." Graves' interest piqued. The Curupra was a mythical forest guardian known for protecting the jungle by luring those who sought to harm it to their deaths. "They say it's been sighted near an isolated village," the professor continued. "And people have started disappearing." Graves nodded slowly, his sharp eyes narrowing. "Tell me everything you know." The professor explained that the disappearances had started a month ago. Hunters and loggers venturing too deep into the jungle never returned. Those who escaped claimed to have heard strange, high-pitched whistles leading them in circles. "They say the Curupra's feet face backward," the professor said, "so it can confuse anyone who tries to track it." Graves considered the story. If the disappearances were tied to the Curupra, they could be another case of myth blending with reality. Or, it could be something, or someone, using the legend as a cover for darker deeds. "Where's this village?" Graves asked. The professor handed him a map. "It's remote, far from the usual paths. But if anyone can solve this, it's you." Graves set out for the Amazon the next morning, the weight of a new case pressing on him. As he journeyed deeper into the rainforest, the air grew thicker, the sounds of the jungle enveloping him. He thought of Lago do Cicero and the delicate balance he had restored there. Could the Curupra's story be another manifestation of nature demanding respect? Or was there something more sinister lurking in the shadows? Graves adjusted his hat and pressed on, the dense greenery closing around him like a living labyrinth. On the third day of his journey, Graves reached the outskirts of the village. The people there were wary, their fear palpable. They told him of strange sightings in the jungle, a figure darting between the trees, its glowing eyes visible in the darkness. That night, as Graves prepared to rest, he heard a sound that sent shivers down his spine, a faint, melodic whistle echoing through the trees. He rose, gripping his iron dagger, and stepped into the dense foliage. The whistle grew louder, its tone playful yet menacing. And then, for a fleeting moment, he saw it, a figure with glowing eyes and feet that faced backward, disappearing into the shadows. Graves' heart raced. The Curupra wasn't just a story. It was real, and it was watching him. Detective Elric Graves had barely fallen asleep in a small hotel room in São Paulo when the dream began. The room around him dissolved, and he found himself standing by the river in Lago do Cicero. The air was thick with mist, the water unnaturally still. He heard it before he saw her, the soft, mournful wail that had haunted the village. "La Llorona," Graves muttered, his voice steady despite the chill creeping up his spine. The spectral figure emerged from the mist, her white dress billowing as if moved by an unseen breeze. Her long, dark hair obscured her face, but her hollow, glowing eyes pierced through the strands. "You called to me," she said, her voice echoing with sorrow. I called to help you, Graves replied. And I did. The seal is restored. You're free. Her laugh was soft, almost mocking. Free? No, detective. You misunderstand. My pain lingers, even if my wails have ceased. Graves frowned. What do you want from me? La Llorona raised her head, her gaze locking onto his. To remember. To bear witness. My story is not over, and neither is yours. Graves jolted awake, his heart pounding. The room was dark and quiet, but the faint echo of her voice lingered in his ears. The next night, Graves found himself in the dream again. This time, the river was overflowing, its waters dark and churning violently. He stood on the bank, watching helplessly as the current dragged debris and fragments of memories downstream, children's toys, broken mirrors, and shards of a cracked stone. La Llorona appeared beside him, her presence as unsettling as before. This is what remains of me, she said, gesturing to the river. Fragments of sorrow, carried endlessly. Graves turned to her. You wanted me to restore balance. The seal is intact. Why are you still tied to this place? She stepped closer, her form flickering like a candle flame. The seal binds my pain, not my story. It is you who must carry it now. Me? Graves asked, narrowing his eyes. You saw me, she said softly. You listened. And now, you must ensure others do the same. My grief must not be forgotten, or it will consume you as it consumed me. Graves woke with a start, her final words ringing in his ears, carry the sorrow, detective, or it will carry you. Graves avoided sleep the next night, fearing another visit from La Llorona. He spent the evening at his desk, reviewing old case files by the dim light of a desk lamp. But as the hours stretched into early morning, exhaustion overtook him, and he drifted off. This time, the dream was different. He wasn't by the river, but in a dense fog, surrounded by faint whispers. Shapes moved in the distance, children running, a mother crying. La Llorona's voice cut through the haze. Do you understand, detective? Why I weep? Graves turned, searching for her form in the mist. You lost your children. Your grief became your prison. She emerged from the fog, her expression unreadable. It is more than that. Grief is not just loss, it is what comes after. The silence, the forgetting. Her voice grew sharper. Do not let my story fade into silence, Elric Graves. Remember it. Tell it. Only then will the cycle end. Graves stood in his dream before the river once more, its waters eerily calm. La Llorona sat on the bank, cradling a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Why show me this? He asked, sitting cautiously beside her. This is not just my story, detective, she said, her tone softer than before. It is the story of all who grieve without solace. My tears are not mine alone. They belong to every mother, every soul who has lost and been forgotten. Graves watched as the bundle in her arms dissolved into mist, carried away by the river's current. The seal holds my pain, she continued. But pain is not destroyed. It is carried forward, like the water in this river. Who will bear it, if not you? I can't carry your pain forever, Graves said, his voice firm. I have my own life, my own battles. La Llorona turned to him, her hollow eyes piercing. Then ensure it does not return. Tell my story, detective. Keep my sorrow alive in words, not in wails. On the fifth night, Graves found himself in a dream unlike the others. He stood in a vast field of water, stretching endlessly in all directions. La Llorona appeared before him, her figure less spectral and more human. This is the last time I will visit you, she said. Graves crossed his arms. Good. I've had enough of nightmares. She smiled faintly, her expression almost kind. I am not your nightmare, Elric. I am your warning. What do you mean? He asked, his voice edged with frustration. Llorona reached out, her fingers brushing against his hand. For a moment, he felt the weight of her grief, overwhelming and suffocating. You are like me, she said. You carry the pain of others. If you are not careful, it will consume you. Do not let your wails become louder than your voice. Graves woke in a cold sweat, her final words etched into his mind, remember me, but do not become me. The dreams of Llorona faded after that final night, leaving Detective Elric Graves with a peculiar sense of calm. She had left him with words that felt less like a curse and more like a charge, a responsibility to remember her sorrow and ensure it wasn't lost to silence. Back in Sao Paulo, Graves spent his days preparing for the next case, but the weight of her warning lingered. He found himself revisiting the journal he had taken from Consuela, flipping through its brittle pages filled with sketches of seals, symbols, and rituals. Each entry told a story, fragments of grief and resolution left behind by healers who had come before him. One evening, he sat in his small hotel room, the faint hum of the city outside his window. He opened his notebook and began writing, recording the details of the case in Lago do Cicero. But this time, he didn't focus solely on the facts. He wrote about Llorona herself, her story, her pain, and her plea for remembrance. Days later, Graves returned to Lago do Cicero for a brief visit. The village had changed in subtle ways. The air felt lighter, the villagers more at ease. The shrine by the river had grown, adorned with candles, flowers, and small tokens left by visitors. Consuela met him at the shrine, her weathered face breaking into a smile. You've come back, she said. Just for a moment, Graves replied, placing a small figurine of a weeping woman on the altar. I wanted to see how things were. She nodded, her gaze fixed on the river. The people remember now. They respect the water, the stories it holds. It's as it should be. Graves stayed for a while, watching the sunlight dance on the water's surface. Before he left, he turned to Consuela. If the seal ever breaks again, you'll know where to find me. As Graves journeyed back to the bustling heart of Sao Paulo, he carried with him more than just memories of the case. Llorona's final words echoed in his mind, remember me, but do not become me. He thought about the weight of his work, the lives lost, the stories untold. He understood now that it wasn't just about solving mysteries or confronting supernatural threats. It was about preserving the stories that mattered, ensuring that the pain and struggles of the past didn't vanish into the void. Sitting in a quiet cafe, he pulled out his notebook and added one final note to his account of Llorona's case. Her sorrow was not a punishment but a plea, to remember what we lose, and to carry it forward with care. With that, Graves closed the notebook, finished his coffee, and stepped out into the bustling streets. The world was full of mysteries, and his work was far from over. But now, he carried a deeper understanding of the balance between life, death, and the stories that connected them. And somewhere, in the quiet ripples of a distant river, a weeping woman's lament had finally turned to silence.